The 1980s was a time when high-tech interiors were becoming the norm on a number of different vehicles. Didn't matter whether you got a Corvette as an example, a Nissan 300ZX, or even a Chevrolet Cavalier. Many of these vehicles had standard or optional electronic dashboards that provided not only interesting and useful information, but also had some, well, let's call it quirky designs associated with them. Perhaps the quirkiest of all time is the Nissan 300ZX that has this horizontal RPM gauge that moves up and down as the RPMs also increase. Or another one might be the Subaru XT5 that has, I don't believe, a instrument cluster design that's been seen before or since, with kind of a horizon line speedometer as well as tachometer. Pretty sweet. Now, in the 1980s, Pontiac was also trying to get into this high-tech theme and certainly introduced a number of truly high-tech interiors. One could say that it began a little bit with the 1982 Firebird and Firebird Trans Am that had kind of that cockpit theme to them, or aircraft theme, complete with the long hood over the instruments, as well as the Allen screws, or, well, fake Allen screws in many cases, gave the interior this aircraft, industrial-like look that at least had some element of high-tech associated with it in terms of looks, although there really wasn't any digital displays until the Firebird, until the dash was redesigned. The theme continued as the 80s went on for Pontiac, and I would say the Fiero interior certainly had a bit of a techie theme to it, but really a modular techie theme. And perhaps the most high-tech of the production Pontiac interiors was the Pontiac 6000, particularly the ones with the electronic instrument cluster that had that kind of 45-degree tachometer that was arranged horizontally, had a whole system of warning lights to display in the event that there was something wrong with a particular system or the door was left ajar. And it had a lot of buttons all over the interior, too, in particular for the radio. And, of course, to complement the high-tech theme on the 6000, it also ended up getting optional steering wheel controls in some versions of it that just gave you more buttons. And the steering wheel controls would proliferate across other Pontiacs as well. But there's one Pontiac that had a super high-tech dashboard. Now, unfortunately, this dashboard didn't make it through to production and was considerably neutered along the way. But let's take a look at it now and see what you think. This was to be a high-tech dashboard for an all-new Pontiac for the 1985 model year, and I think I just gave it away for the Pontiac aficionados, but I'll string it out a little longer for those who aren't the Pontiac aficionados. And take a look at the kind of 45-degree angle horizontal speedometer as well as tachometer in this particular dash, and full digital gauges for engine temperature, oil pressure, and volts. The odometer and trip odometer do appear to be conventional. But if you look at the right area there of the steering wheel and the center console, you also notice that designers in this particular mock-up were proposing a whole array of system check warning lights. You can see there if your door was ajar, the hood is open, the trunk is open. Beneath that was HVAC controls that were somewhat standard GM fare, but remember, many GM vehicles during this time period had the horizontal sliders that would control the mode on the top, and the bottom slider was for the temperature. Here you can see that there's just buttons for the mode, and not quite sure where the temperature is regulated on this. I don't see it in this particular picture, but in any event, Pontiac was trying to get away from the simple slider bars and have buttons that were affected by electric motors to move the doors around for the HVAC system as opposed to vacuum. And as an example, the Fiero got those buttons and the electric damper motors. There is, of course, the standard Delco GM ETR radio underneath the HVAC controls, and unfortunately, GM really just standardized the radios across all the offerings, and they all looked the same, weren't really well integrated into the overall design, but that's what it was. Turning to the steering wheel for a second, you do notice that this particular mock-up has a two-spoke steering wheel that Pontiac ended up not offering, but it does have some cool little thumb rests there at the 10 and 2 position up at the top of the wheel, and the cruise control switches in the middle of the wheel, and The two-spoke design here is actually quite nice because it enables full visibility of the gauges, given that those spokes are relatively low in the overall wheel. So I think this would have been pretty successful. You'll also notice controls for the headlamps as well as the wipers are mounted very close to the steering wheel. And this was a philosophy that Pontiac interior designers had at the time, and that was that they wanted you to be able to control various functions without having to move your hand off of the wheel, or if you had to take it off of the wheel, you didn't have to go very far. Hence the steering wheel controls that I was previously mentioning, but there's no steering wheel controls here aside from the cruise control, but you do have the headlamps and wiper controls very close by that you could actuate, presumably even with your hand still on the wheel. Now, one element of this theme that did make it through to production was the vents there for the air conditioning and vent contained in the dashboard. Those ended up being pretty close to what was the final product. Now let's take a look at the final product, and you can see how this theme was really dumbed down from what you see here to what made it through to production. And here's the production version for the 1985 model year. This is the interior of the 1985 Pontiac Grand Am. And you can see that the production interior retained some of those elements of the proposal that I just showed you, but it definitely lost some things. It does have that rising tachometer there. You can't see it in this picture. I'll show another one in a second, but it did just have a simple digital speedometer. It didn't have a second rising graph. I'm guessing because the engineers as well as the designers ended up thinking it was a bit too complicated to read two kind of rising horizontal graphs at the same time. And it does have that system of warning lights there off to the right. You do notice that the Grand Am ended up losing the push-button HVAC controls in favor of the typical slider bar controls that GM had with the mode at the top and the heater control at the bottom. It does have the standard radio, and you do notice that the vents are pretty similar to the proposal, as well as the controls for the wipers and lights. Of course, the steering wheel is different. In this case, you have a 4-spoke steering wheel as opposed to the 2-spoke that was in the proposal. And my guess is that obstructed vision a little bit. And you can kind of see that it obstructed vision a little bit here, but the spokes were still low enough that you could read the instrument panel items. The cruise control was also incorporated into that multi-function stalk, as opposed to having the buttons on the steering wheel like the proposal. I guess one cool thing about this production model, this particular one in the photo, is that it has a manual transmission, which is pretty rare for the Grand Ams, but I think that's pretty cool. And here's a picture from the 1985 brochure. You can see that speedometer there is just a simple digital, literally digital readout of the speed, and the warning light bank, as well as the temperature, oil pressure, and voltmeter gauges. Pontiac called this the optional rally instrumentation. You got the analog tachometer, the digital electronic speedometer, the fuel level indicator, and a complete driver information center with the relevant warning lights. Now, the funny thing about this Grand Am is that on the outside, it also was a first in one big area for Pontiac, and that is it was the first Pontiac to have this rib theme that would continue on for many years in the future. And you can see the ribs here on this 85 Grand Am. They were inspired by the ribs in the bottoms of a number of Mercedes from years prior. And the rib theme would actually be on a number of different GM cars, including the 1986 Seville. I guess it just gave that body side just some different sculpture to it and a little bit different look. The interesting thing about the Pontiac ribs, though, is that Pontiac had two different exterior studios during this time. And the individual who was in charge of one of the studios that did half of the cars liked the ribs. The individual who was in charge of the other studio that did vehicles like the Firebirds, let's just say, didn't like them. And so you got two different views of Pontiac depending upon which studio chief was producing the car. One who liked the ribs and proliferated across other vehicles, as an example, the 1988 Grand Prix, and one who didn't like that and consequently didn't proliferate it across the vehicles and produce vehicles like the Firebird. So another little tidbit of interesting Pontiac history there for you. Now, the somewhat unfortunate part about the 1985 Grand Am is that while it was, I think, from an exterior perspective, a looker, and even the final interior was a good-looking interior, although some of the materials weren't ideal. Under hood, there was the 2.5-liter Iron Duke 4-cylinder that was the standard engine. It made 92 horsepower, and optional was a 3-liter V6 derived from the Buick V6 engine that made 125 horsepower. So the most horsepower you could get in this Grand Am was 125, which for the era wasn't bad, but the Iron Duke, although very reliable, really wasn't a sporty engine. And the car really had this athletic look to it, albeit an athletic but formal look. So the engine choices didn't necessarily agree with the overall styling. In any event, hope you enjoyed that spotlight on this 1985 Pontiac Grand Am and its interior. Thanks again for watching.